Hi, I'm Henning from Flipnomals.com, and let's get into my approach for shading and lighting my Clicker project from The Last of Us using Substance Painter and Blender. Now, if you prefer an article instead of just a video, we have a written tutorial on this exact topic over at blog.flipnomals.com, which covers the whole thing as well, step by step. This is very similar to this video. Starting in Substance Painter, this is where we ended in the texturing video of this project. As you can see, all the maps are now done. And if you break this down, you can see that we essentially only have two maps. We have the base color, and then we have the roughness maps. If you spend a lot of time on the actual sculpt, you really don't need a whole lot more than that. In this case, the high frequency, like all the pores and all that, is just done in decimation, and we brought the decimator model into Painter, and then we brought an even higher decimator version into Blender. So we're straight up rendering the decimator version, and this keeps it really simple. Once the texture maps are done, I've simply exported them out as this separate texture set with only the base color and the roughness, which we are going to pick up in Blender. In Blender, the very first thing I recommend that you do is that you change the LUT from Filmic to AGX. AGX is a new LUT, which is honestly just better than Filmic. There's a link to where you can download AGX in the description, but you can also simply just Google AGX and you're going to find this on GitHub. Once you've installed AGX, you simply go down all the way down under your render settings to color management. You make sure display device is set to sRGB, view transform is AGX, and the look is punchy. Even if you aren't using AGX, I highly recommend that you use Filmic, simply because the render will be much more balanced. So once we have this installed and all set up, then it's important to just clean up the scene just a little bit. In this case here, we have all the pieces in, and these are imported directly from ZBrush, and these are decimated. And that means that this is simply the high-res model that has been optimized to retain its shape and details, or keeping the poly count low. In this case, each model has a different poly count depending on how important it is. For instance, the head has a much higher poly count than these little mushrooms here on this side. And the poly count that's good is really the one that fits your system. I tend to make this as high as possible while still being able to render and not crashing Blender. So with this said, now we have all the objects, and I'm going to start making collections for them. So the collections I have here would really be the same models from ZBrush. I haven't really changed them a whole lot. Should have probably renamed these a little bit nicer, but here we go. One thing I've added as well that we haven't spoken about is the fact that I've added a quick wet line. This is simply a model that's right here, and this is a very, very simple model. This is basically just a cube that's been extruded out here and just has a wet material on it, basically just a glass material, as that makes it a lot more realistic, since it integrates the gums a lot more and makes it seem like you have a bit of like saliva here. But apart from that, all these are just the same models we've already had in previous videos. And then we have a simple environment, and the environment is very, very, very simple. This is simply just a cube that has been extruded out on the sides here, or rather a plane that's been extruded. And this just has a very simple material, like a really black material. And this is simply just to block off any lights from like environments or anything like that if we were to use an HDRI, which we're ultimately not using, but it's still kind of nice to have it here because then we can control it quite nicely. And this is just put in an environmental backdrop. Then we have a camera group, and here we have two main cameras. One is more of a medium shot, and one is a proper close-up shot. And it's really handy to have two because you can try out different camera angles really pretty quickly. And then we have a light group that contains all the lights, and that's where we are going to be starting off right now. So we're starting off with the key light, and this is simply an area light in a pretty high up position, but also pretty frontal lit. When I'm lighting, I tend to keep either 20-30% in light or 20-30% in shadow. I try to avoid it being like 50-50. In this case, you can see that the vast majority is in light. And this is just a general good rule for lighting. It just makes the lighting more comfortable. What I'm doing here as well is I'm trying to establish more of a focal point. I want people to be looking at around this area here. So I'm making this area here a bit brighter, but also you don't have too much control with just a single light. In this case here, you can go under the light settings, and I've just added a little bit of color to it. I tend to add a little bit of color to all my lights, as it just makes it just a bit more vibrant. Even in a case like this, where this is quite a neutral light. As a tip, whenever I'm lighting, instead of dragging the slider, I tend to just multiply by 2 to make it twice as bright, or divide by 2 to make it half the brightness. This is just a quick way to change the brightness instead of finding the exact values. It's never about exact values. It's always just about the rough feeling of it. And then you can, of course, tweak this later on if you want to have like highly precise values. But I find this to be a good way of doing it. Basically make it twice as bright or half as bright. And then we have the fill light. The fill light is here to simply brighten up the darker parts, because without the fill light, you can see it's really dark, and we don't want this to be perfectly black. So I'm just using a fill light in this case. I'm not using an HDRI for this project at all. I want to control the lighting fully, and I found that this worked really well. Really what I'm doing here is I'm just using a 3-point light setup, which has a key light, a fill light, and a rim light. What I was missing at this point though was separating the character out a little bit more from the background. It was getting a little dark here and it was blending in a little too much. So I added a rim light as well. And this just separates him out a little bit from the background. As you can see down here, and it just adds a bit more. This is more prominent once you're adding subsurface as well. And this is one of the ones you can go really crazy with. You can really like amp this up, but I found that this was just a little bit too crazy. And speaking of subsurface, it's really hard to light and shade, like do the look dev independently of each other. These are highly interconnected processes. For instance, when we're adding subsurface on a character, we're getting feedback as to the light intensity, if it works or not. The specularity is changing drastically based on the lighting. So you really have to be more holistic about it instead of simply just putting up lights and then doing your shading and then doing rendering. You need to constantly be changing the lighting based on the feedback from the materials. As a little heads up and disclaimer, this is not really how you would do it in a professional VFX workflow. What we're doing now is we're setting up a camera, we're basically locking the camera to it, and then we're lighting based on this. And that works really well for our purposes. But if you're doing a character for a full shot or a full sequence, that character would need to work from all angles. So in that case, you would set up a neutral lighting and look type environment, which is more generic than this, where you don't really have too many colors in the lights, where you know if it works in that setup, it's going to work in all other setups. So this works well for this case, but don't confuse this with a full-on professional lighting and look dev setup. And then it was getting a bit too bright up here. So what I'm doing is I'm simply just adding a light blocker. This is the simplest thing in the world. This is literally just a polygonal plane I've just placed up here. This is how you can change lighting a lot, where if you just start to think about how you would do this in a physical world, instead of going into like fancy shader techniques or something like that, if you were to be lighting this on set in the real world and you want to have more shadows on the back, how do you do it? Well, you just put some cardboard or something in front of the light, and then you'll block out that light. So you can see this does quite a lot actually, where this one right now, you can see this is really bright, and then we add this. And it just focuses it just a little bit. It's not like a crazy amount, but it just helps to focus this. In terms of the cameras as well, I always tend to lock the cameras. So you can do that very easily just by going under the object properties and then just dragging on here. You can see now these are unlocked, and just by doing this, you're now locking them. This is really, really handy because you are accidentally going to do this a lot, where you tend to, like if you have lock camera to view enabled, then you're going to accidentally keep changing the camera. And Blender does not have viewport undos or camera undos, which means that if you have a perfect camera set up like this and you move it around, you actually can't go back to it. You have to literally go back to an older file. So definitely make sure to lock the camera like this. This is going to be really beneficial. I do also recommend adding what I'm doing here, adding lock camera to view as well in the quick favorites. You can do this easily just by going to hitting the N key and then going to view, and then you have this one here, camera to view, and just right click and then add to quick favorites. This is really handy because you often want to do this whenever you are rotating around in the camera or setting up lights and finding the camera angle and such. So let's get into the actual shading part of this. What you have to do is select each part of the model and assigning a material based on the texture sets you have in Painter. In this case, the tongue and the rest of the head is going to be one texture set. The top mushrooms are going to be one, the neck mushrooms is going to be one, and the teeth is going to be one material. This is something that you will define essentially when you are UV mapping your character. All this is very interconnected. The UV mapping of the character is determining essentially your materials at this point. So really think about the whole process early on. So I've simply just assigned very simple materials to this, just generic materials. And I've just made the base color just like a more of a neutral gray, so it will fit the lighting a bit better. And then we are going to go into the various materials. We're going to go into the head, just select the head. And then we're going to just assign the various texture maps. One of my core principles whenever I'm texturing is I try to keep my texture maps as final as I can, meaning that they don't rely on color corrections and masking and all that in a look dev solution like Blender. The reason is if you have a texture map that's more brownish exported from Painter, you take it into Blender, you start to color correct it, you make it a bit more greenish, you start to modify the roughness using nodes. And then you want to change it later on, you want to make it a bit more red. It's really tricky to actually do that because now do you change the maps from Painter or do you change the hue and saturation, the whole shader network? It's just really tricky. So I tend to bring my texture maps into Blender, then I do my color corrections to them, seeing what actually needs to happen. For instance, a hue and saturation can work really well. Then I do the exact same hue and saturation in Painter. And I actually export the maps out again from Painter into Blender. I delete all my shader networks and now it should look exactly the same. It just means that I keep the texturing software as the master and I just import the maps here. And this means that the shader setup is dead simple. So we are going to start just by hitting Shift and A, and then we're going to type image. And we're just going to have an image texture. And now we are just opening this up. And then just selecting the head base color. You can see we're using UDIMs for this, but in this case, we just have a few UDIMs, so very easy. So just bring this in here, and now you're going to see on the bottom, this has UDIMs here, and this is set to sRGB, which is correct. And then I'm just going to duplicate this one, Shift and D, and then we do the same thing here. We are setting this to roughness as well. And now we have the two maps I need for this. And then I'm going to be setting the subsurface to 1, and this is essentially a balance between subsurface and base color. So in this case, if the subsurface is going to be like red or pink or whatever, currently there is no subsurface, and this is set to like 50. Now it's going to be 50%, and now it's set to 1. It's going to be 100%, meaning that it's just basically just a blend between the base color and the subsurface. Then we're going to be changing the subsurface amount to random walk fixed radius. I find this to be a much better way of working compared to the default random walk, since I have more control with this one. And then we are going to be plugging the base color into the subsurface color. And now you're going to be able to see we have subsurface. But the problem is that the subsurface is far, far too strong. The way we are fixing this is not by reducing the subsurface here or going in and tweaking the radius, because this is a mess. It's really hard to know what's actually going on here. You could, of course, visualize it like the red, green, and blue, and you can just adjust these values. So instead, we are going to be using a mix RGB, Shift A, type mix RGB, and then we are going to be using this color as the radius. And this means we can actually choose the colors using like our eyes instead of using math. So set the FAC all the way to 0. And this means that the color 1 is going to be the slot we're using. And the color we're choosing now is essentially going to be both the value, meaning how strong is the subsurface, but also the actual hue of the subsurface. In this case, you can see it's red, but we can change this as well to something else. So the first thing we'll do, we are simply just going to plug this into the subsurface radius. And now you're going to see that the color indeed changed to this. If we change the color now to pink, you're going to see that this is going to be scattering pink. And now if you just leave this in a neutral way, if you go here and just go and remove the saturation, you can see it's now, we can make it all the way white, so it's really extreme. But if you now were to just change the value of this all the way down, you can see what happens. The subsurface really disappears. So the value controls the amount of subsurface and the color controls the hue. So this is a pretty intuitive way of working. And then what I tend to do is I tend to use a pretty low value with this. And like something like this depends on the scale, but something like 0.03 tends to work really well for me. But again, this does depend on your scale, and it depends very much on which model you are using. With the fixed radius, this is these values are completely different from if you're using just a random, the default random walk. So now we are just going to be changing this to something like, let's choose here the value, something like 0.042. That's fine. And then we're going to pick a color, and the color is going to be like this darkish red color, darkish red or darkish like brownish color. And this is going to be subtle, and you want this to be kind of subtle, because if you're exaggerating this too much, the character is going to seem like it's made of wax. So something like this is actually quite nice. And now you can see that the roughness is set to 1, which we definitely don't want. We want to use a roughness map. But before that, we have to change the color space to generic data. This is different if you are using Filmic or not Filmic or AGX. If you are using AGX, your scalar maps, meaning black and white maps or data maps, should be set to generic data. And then you simply just plug the roughness into the roughness. And this should just work out of the box. And the reason this should work out of the box is that I've tested this back and forth in the texturing phase. So at this point, when it comes to adding the materials, doing the materials, I'm more thinking about what is the actual material made out of, like what is the surface made out of, not so much what specifically is the color and the roughness, because I should have really defined that before. And now you can see we have some nice roughness on our character, and we have some nice SSS as well. And this is the same approach for all of the other maps. So we are just going to be choosing this one here, and then we are simply just doing the same thing as before. Shift A, image, duplicate this guy, Shift and D. This is going to be our roughness, so just plug this into roughness, and this is going to be our subsurface, so plug this into subsurface color, and then we're just going to be assigning these textures and changing this to generic data. And now the head shroom should be working. And now just changing this to generic data, and then just changing the SSS to random walk fixed radius, and then setting the subsurface all the way up. And then same thing as before, our mix RGB node. Just moving this up here. You can also just straight up just copy it from this one here. That's what I'm going to be doing. So you can see the subsurface is way too strong now. So just plug this in, and then it's the subsurface radius. And there we go. Now we have the head shrooms. Now we need the teeth and the neck shrooms. And you guessed it, same approach for that. So we are just going to be time-lapsing ahead just a little bit. And that's really it for the materials. Like I said before, it's really simple once you've done a good job in Painter, and once you've already iterated a bit back and forth between this, then assigning it and the actual final material becomes quite simple. The key to skin shading in Blender or in Arnold or wherever you're doing, like I developed this first in Arnold, so this should definitely work there as well, is don't use a base color. Use a full subsurface, plug the diffuse into the subsurface color, and use a color for the radius. In this case, we're using a mix RGB node, a FAC set to 0, and then a dark and saturated color for the actual value. And this is a simple and powerful system. For the roughness, keep it simple and just plug it straight into the roughness slot. If you need to modulate this later on, like if you need to change the value of this, the best way to do this is to use a map range node, and then you can plug this in, you can adjust these values here. Then if you do that, I recommend Control-Shift clicking on the map radius, and now you can see what's happening here. So now you can adjust the values up and down, where brighter means it's more rough and darker means it's smoother. So this is like a good way of doing it. So now, for instance, if we were to change this, like Control-Shift clicking on the material again, we should be able to see that the neck mushrooms are much more specky than before. And then use Control-X to remove it from your shader network. And now really the last thing we need to do in terms of the look is we need to set up depth of field. And first, select the camera you want. And then here's a little tip. If you see the little icon here, this is the active camera icon. So if you click on this one, this is going to change the active camera to a different one. And clicking on this is going to change the active camera here. This is the same as going under your scene properties and changing the active camera here. It's just a lot easier since it's just a single click like so. So the way we set up depth of field is very simple. Select the correct camera, the render camera, then go to your camera properties all the way on the bottom here, under the data object properties. Then we go all the way down. And here we have a button called, or checkbox called depth of field. If you enable this, you now get depth of field, and by default, you just get a distance. The problem is distances kind of suck. You don't really know exactly what it's like. You have to use a ruler and all that. A much better way of doing it is use a depth of field object. And this is very simple to do. You simply just make a new empty, or it can be any object really, but just an empty. And then you place this where you want the object to be sharp. So in this case, we want it to be around here because this is the area you want to be sharp. And you can see I've already done this. So this is this guy here. And this is the one that's actually under the camera. It's called depth of field, or DOF, and then empty. And you don't have to do anything else with this. The only thing that matters in this case is that this is in the correct position. And then you go all the way down again to your properties, and then what you have to change is the f-stop. This is similar to a real world camera. So a lower value means more blur. So if you set this to like 0.01, this is going to be blurry as crazy now. But if you set this to 210, then it's going to be really sharp. Now this depends on your scene scale. So if this is like 10 meters, you probably won't really get depth of field. So that's actually why you see up here in the character, I had to have a scale group because the scale was wrong on my actual character. Because honestly, this was just a ZBrush doodle that turned into something larger. So I didn't really consider the scale because so much is dependent on the actual scale. So by setting the scale correctly, even stuff like depth of field is going to be easier. So in this case here, we're using a pretty low value, something like 0.3. And this is like a nice value. You don't want this to be like crazy blurry because then it looks like this guy's tiny. And by making something really blurry, you're also making it more beautiful. And we don't really want this guy to be beautiful. Like if you want something to look really appealing, like look really cute, then you can add a lot of depth of field. It just means that everything is softer. And if you want something to be like scary and all that, then you can make it really sharp. You can see all the details. So something like 0.3 is a good value for me, but this depends entirely on your character. And then for the blades, this is basically what the depth of field is going to look like. This is also like based on real world cameras. I'm just setting this to 5 because that makes it nice and just squarish. And that's really it for the final look of the character. Now we just have to talk briefly about render settings, and we can do that if we go all the way up to the render settings. And then in terms of my device, I'm using GPU. The only reason I'm using CPU is because this video will crash if I use GPU. So I need to set this to GPU. So I need to set this to CPU for video purposes only, but I'm using a GPU for normal rendering. And GPU rendering is stupidly fast. This whole character in full HD will take around a minute and a half to render, and I have a 4-year-old mid-sized GPU. So if you have a new beastie GPU, this is done in like 30 seconds or so. In terms of the samples for the viewport, this is usually set quite a lot higher. Again, this is to make sure that my video doesn't crash, but setting this to something like 500 is going to look quite nice. You don't want it to go all the way because then it's just going to keep on computing all the time. But you want this to look similar to what the final render is going to be like. I don't use denoising for the viewport rendering. And the reason is that there's so much texture in this character, and the denoising, if you just enable this one, it's just going to remove a lot of that texture and has to keep going for a while to see that. So in this case, I actually far prefer having more noise in my render, but seeing the texture instead of having something that's super clean but without texture. So if you look at, like, for instance, this area here now, it looks really bland. It looks perfect in terms of noise, but it looks way too stylized. So if I disable denoising, you can see that, yes, it's noisier, but it's more true to what it's actually going to look like. And then for the final render settings, I set the noise threshold to 0.01 and max samples to a high number. Specifically what this number is, it doesn't matter a whole lot. I found that around 1500 to 2000 is a good number for me. The reason this number is so high is, first, you have subsurface, which requires a lot of samples. Subsurface is very heavy sample. The second reason is that we are using area lights that are also very hungry for samples because the shadows are so soft. And the third and most important reason is simply that we're using depth of field, and depth of field is very hungry for samples. You don't want noise in your depth of field. I guess technically depth of field would be the sharp part, but colloquially depth of field would just be the blurry part. So essentially, My approach to this is just set it to a number where you don't have noise. Honestly, you can't really optimize the scene too much when it comes to this. Like the render settings of today are really simple. It's basically what are your samples. So essentially you're just talking about what is the acceptable noise amount you want, and my acceptable noise is none. So my approach is set it to a high number, let it render until there's no more noise. I just go have a cup of tea or something, and then I just come back. For this, I do actually denoise it, but I denoise just the final pixels, meaning that it will just do its thing and remove as much noise as it can, and then I'm using a denoiser just at the very end. I've also found it to be important to use the optics denoiser. I found this to be the most stable and by far the fastest. And then once you're done, you simply render. So I'm just going to do a render of this. I'm just going to set this to GPU, pause the video, and get back to that. And that's it for this whole video. This is the final result of the character, which we just shaded and lit in this video. The important part is that you have a really good sculpt before you really start texturing. Once you are texturing, you need to go back and forth constantly between your shading software, in this case Blender, and then your texturing software. If not, you're flying entirely blind and you really have no idea what you're actually doing. So go back and forth constantly between the two software and adjust the values. I also tend to take these kind of renders into Photoshop and doing like global changes to it. And that's one of the reasons why these edges now are nice and orange. They used to be more red, but I did a huge shift in Photoshop on them and thought that looked cool. And then I did those changes back in Painter. And it means that the setup is really nice and simple in terms of the shaders. In terms of skin shading in Blender, make sure to use the random walk fixed radius and use a mix RGB node for the radius as well. If you're interested in more content like this as well, I highly recommend our realistic character portrait masterclass. This is where we're making this character here from scratch. It's using the exact same workflow from these videos, the 3 videos we have on the clicker, where we are sculpting in ZBrush, where we're topologizing in Blender, UV mapping in Blender, and going back and forth between Painter and Blender to develop the look, and finally rendering the whole thing in Blender, where we're also doing hair and fur as well for the eyebrows. So I highly recommend this full course as well. It's about 21 hours long and we go through all the steps in real time. So if you enjoyed this series of YouTube videos, I'm sure you're going to enjoy this course as well. It's taught by myself and the style is very similar to that. So yeah, that's it for this video. So make sure to like, comment and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.